Alrighty, so good morning. We're in Acts chapter 12, continuing our way through this morning. For those who weren't here last week, we covered verses 1 to 11, which concerned primarily the escape of Peter from prison through the aid of an angel. We covered that in very interesting detail. This morning we're covering a bit of a shorter passage, verses 12 through 19, and then the week after we'll finish the chapter off, or in the lesson after, the week after, verses 20 to 25. I've decided to subdivide those into two smaller portions, just simply because they're covering two different thematic events. But this morning, those verses 12 through 19 are covering, it's the follow-on from what we had last week, so covering the aftermath, I suppose one could say, of this escape from prison. So let me read the passage in full, we'll pray, and then we'll begin our study from there. So Acts chapter 12, verses 12 to 19. When he realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose other name is Mark, where many were gathered together and praying. And when he knocked at the door of the gateway, a servant named Rhoda came to answer. Recognizing Peter's voice, in her joy she did not open the gate, but ran in and reported that Peter was standing at the gate. They said to her, "You are out of your mind." But she kept insisting that it was so, and they kept saying, "It is his angel." But Peter continued knocking, and when they opened, they saw him and were amazed. But motioning to them with his hand to be silent, he described to them how the Lord had brought him out of prison. He said, "Tell these things to James and to the brothers." Then he departed and went to another place. Now when the day came, there was no little disturbance among the soldiers over what had become of Peter. And after Herod searched him and found nothing, he examined the sentries and ordered that they should be put to death. Then he went down from Judea to Caesarea and spent time there. Let's pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, to read them, to mark them, to learn them, and to inwardly digest them, in order that we may embrace and ever hold fast to the blessed hope in Jesus Christ. Amen. So, as I mentioned at the top, this is covering this is like the follow-on. This is Luke filling in the details about what happened in the immediate aftermath of Peter's escape. Obviously very much thematically connected to what we've had read and studied in the last session. There are interesting details here in this portion. And so we'll begin in verse 12. So, verse 12. When he realized this, again realizing what he'd said in verse 11, if you have a look back there at verse 11, it says that when Peter came to himself, kind of realizing that this wasn't a vision, which he had initially thought, that this is actually happening in real time, he said to himself in verse 11, "Now I am sure that the Lord has sent an angel and rescued me from the hand of Herod and from all that the Jews, so that the Jewish people were expecting." In other words, to put him to death. And so then when he realized this, that's what verse 12 is saying to us, following on from that. He realized this, and then he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose other name is Mark. So the one who we refer to as John Mark, or otherwise just simply Mark. Mary, and this is why the authors of not just the Gospels but the book of Acts as well, always make sure they try and highlight which Mary is actually being talked about. Mary is still a relatively common name today. It was the most common name in the first century among the Jews. So identifying which Mary is which is often a task that the historical accounter, in this case Luke in the book of Acts, has to do. Not Mary, the mother of Jesus, not Mary Magdalene, not any of the other Marys. This is Mary, the mother of John Mark, right? And so it's at her house. This is a relatively similar scenario to what we've encountered before. Again, the churches were meeting They were no longer able to just simply meet in the temple or the tabernacles anymore. Okay, because again, we're over a decade now into this, and despite the fact they were initially meeting in the temple and synagogues, which if you can hearken your mind back to the early opening chapters 1, 2, and 3, particularly chapter 3, Peter and John are arrested after having preached and taught in the temple complex. They're meeting in the houses of Christians. Now, to have a house of that size, particularly one with an upper room like we find at Pentecost, it required someone with a sizable home, someone who was wealthy. So the house of Mary, the mother of John Mark, is by definition wealthy, because this kind of situation would not have been possible to be housing or to be hosting this many people. So it's obviously one of the locations in Jerusalem where the Church of Jerusalem met. Okay, and so there were many who were gathered. We're told in the end of verse 12, and they were praying. Right. So this is following on from the details that we got earlier, back in whereabouts? Verse 5. If you have a look back at verse 5, we're told that Peter was kept in prison, but earnest prayer for him was made to God by the church. Okay, so this is them doing that very same thing. Again, keep in mind, this is the very same night. We haven't progressed in time here at all. This is the same night. This is immediately after he's been liberated from the prison. And so they're all together at this particular location. They're all praying together for Peter. Verse 13. And when he knocked at the door of the gateway, a servant girl named Rhoda came to answer. Now again, houses like this, not just in Judea, but around the Hellenistic world, wealthy houses like this would be 2, if not 3-storied houses. The third story could either just simply be an open roof or an actual upper room on the roof, depending on the architecture, of course. But considering that to be a third floor, people always use their roofs in ancient architecture around the world, particularly for sleeping during the summers, not as cramped and humid inside the house. You would go and sleep up on the roof, for example. You would then have a courtyard, basically, which would either be one-sided or even 3-sided or 4-sided that ran around the entire house. And then you would have a wall around that courtyard with gates, either singular or plural. That was the basic architecture of a wealthy house. And so when it's saying the door at the gateway, it's the gateway. It's the gateway of the fence the wall, right, around the actual house and the courtyards itself. And so you would actually exit the house, cross the courtyard to the gate itself, right? So that's the kind of rough architecture of. Hopefully that makes enough sense. And so he's knocking at the door of the gateway. So he's outside the wall, I should say, basically on the street. And a servant girl named Rhoda is the one who came to answer. Again, we're not given great detail about this servant girl. The fact she's referred to as servant girl is distinct, should be read distinctly from woman. So in other words, she's young. What age? Who knows? But let's say somewhere around the age of 12-ish. Keeping in mind that throughout history, up until not terribly, all that long ago, they did not have this magical category that we've invented for ourselves in the modern day called adolescent or teenager, right? Where we give them all the rights of adulthood but none of the responsibilities. That didn't exist. You were a boy and then a man. You were a girl and then a woman, right? Obviously, in Hebrew culture, that had a distinct marking at the age of transitioning between the age of 12 and 13. So when it's talking about girl, we can generally assume she's probably 12-ish. But again, even still, when we think of a 12-year-old in the modern context, we think, oh, it's a kid who has zero ability to do left, right, this, anything. Not how the world has worked a lot of the time throughout antiquity or in the medieval period. If you were a boy or a girl at 9, 10, 11, 12, you were on the cusp of adulthood, right? You would still be considered a young man or a young woman, but as opposed to a young girl, right? So the responsibilities that were beholden upon a 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old boy or girl a lot more than vastly more than what we demand of the same age group these days. So again, she would be a servant girl in the house of Mary, the mother of Mark John. The categorical distinction between servant and slave is not one that can be drawn out here, because the word being used in the Greek, doulos, gets translated as can be translated either as servant or slave. And again, the concept of a slave, often different than what we tend to picture. In this kind of context, there's a 0% chance that she was what we would call chattel slavery. Right? So when we think of chattel slavery, which comes from the French word for cattle, we think of, rightfully, Southern Democrat slave ownership in America, for example, right before the Civil War, back in the 1800s, right? Out in a field, treated literally like cattle. I think I've mentioned it in brevity in the church history classes thus far. In the ancient world, particularly Greco-Roman society, slavery was a much broader designation or category than what we think of as chattel slavery. You had doctors and lawyers who were slaves in Rome. The distinction there, not important. We're not given any contextual things. So servant, slave, again, that designation or distinction is not one that's typically all that important here, because she's not the focus. So servant is why we contextually translate it as servant in this case, because contextually it makes more sense. So a servant girl named Rhoda is the one who comes to answer the door. Verse 14. Recognizing Peter's voice, in her joy, she did not open the gate, but ran inside and reported that Peter was standing at the gate, which I'm sure Peter greatly appreciated. Coming in. So she hears Peter's voice, she's excited, and she's so overjoyed that she actually completely forgets to open the gate, and just runs on in with childlike enjoyment and starts telling everyone about the guy she just left hanging at the gate. And so
I love the way they gave a name in it too.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, pretty much. This is it's kind of more of the meta point here in the story, but I might as well talk about it now. This is one of those settings or examples where someone is mentioned in what is, in the broad scheme of things, a very incidental matter. In this case, literally named, because sometimes we have accounts where the person is mentioned and their story and blah, 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 but the name isn't actually given. And there's just different reasons why that may have the case. But in this case, this is a small incidental story that in the grand scheme of the history of the world is not terribly significant, right? Except for the fact that it's significant in the accounting of this story, right? What you have here is, and obviously we'll talk about more as we go through, but what we have here is this young servant girl, part of the household of faith, so to speak. Again, she would be Christian by the virtue of the fact that she's part of Mary, mother of Mark John's household. This concept we've already seen a household becoming Christian in the case of Cornelius, by virtue of him becoming Christian. By the virtue of others are in that context, the whole household is then considered to be a Christian household. But she's on that account. She obviously knows Peter because she recognizes his voice, right? Because it's saying recognizing Peter's voice, so she actually knows Peter, which makes sense because again, keep in mind Peter has been in Jerusalem. Like we haven't seen Peter gallivanting around the countryside at this point. That's been other people who've been going around in that sense. Peter has been very much stationed with James, particularly, and Peter and James have been spearheading this entire operation thus far.
And she heard him preaching.
Yeah, exactly. So she would have, and that's what I mean by she would have heard him. Yeah, exactly right. And so she knows Peter. She's heard his voice. She's heard him preach and teach, and et cetera, et cetera. And so in her joy, in her exuberation, she leaves him hanging at the gate and runs and runs back in. It's not difficult to picture this. Like if we picture this as a 10 to 12-year-old girl, ballpark it, right, or just 12-year-old, whatever. In typical childlike excitement, gets overwhelmed with joy at hearing Peter, who she's been sitting in the house. She's been hearing everyone else pray. She may have been praying herself, whatever, who knows. But she's been in the house hearing the church gathered there praying for Peter. And then she hears his voice outside. So she runs inside to report that he was standing at the gate. Yep.
There is a different rendering.
Mm-hmm.
I think that if she wasn't 12, maybe she was 15 or 16.
Maybe.
She would have heard the prayers of the congregants because Peter was imprisoned and expected to be executed.
Yep.
She would have heard the congregants praying for his soul.
Definitely, yeah.
And they had a belief in angels.
Yeah, which we're going to come up to. Yeah.
And she thought that she saw Peter's angel.
Maybe, although it depends on what you mean by seen, because I don't think she saw him. I think she just merely heard him through the gate. Yeah, hearing Peter's voice, which I think is why this scenario outlines, because she's run back inside and is telling them. Peter's
out at the gate in that wall. So
Yeah.
Yeah, she's in the courtyard.
Hearing the voice does not preclude seeing the face.
That's true. That literally, we have times where that can be the case. Generally speaking, though, it is that way. It doesn't automatically preclude it, but generally speaking, it is.
I'm just putting it out there because
No.
I like the rendering of the angel, which we're going to come upon.
We're going to come on to that in a minute. We have an example in Revelation where I forget exactly what chapter it's in, 7, I think. Don't quote me on that, but John hears the voice of the 144,000, which again is this symbolic number representing the God's people, and he then turns and sees a number beyond counting, right? Even though he's just said it was 144,000. That's how he hears them. He hears the number of these people, and then he turns and sees them, and it's a number that counts myriads and myriads and etc.
My point about her seeing him is, in my humble submission, confirmed in the last part of verse 14 when she ran in and reported that Peter was standing at the gate. If she only heard a voice, she couldn't have said that Peter was standing at the gate, because standing is a
visual. Yeah, it could maybe. It also could be if I was, I think it also still perfectly fits if she hears him outside the gate and reports that Peter's standing at the gate because she's heard him saying.
Broader, I would have run back into the house immediately.
Yeah.
Forgetting
that he's actually
what had actually happened, that she knew it was Peter.
Yeah.
And she was so excited.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's the excitement and I think that's the main reason why she's then actually mentioned by name, and that this is even an accounting of what goes on here, because it's pointing to the joy and exuberation that she was overcome with, I guess, basically. That her leader and her friend had been rescued. You know what I mean? So, verse 15. They, as in the congregation, they said to her, you're out of your mind. But she kept insisting that it was so, that Peter was out there. And they kept saying, it is his angel. Now, this does require a bit of context historically. Commonly held belief, not just in the Old Testament but the New Testament, that that the people of God, and like an individual person, had what basically we would refer to today as a guardian angel. Okay. Moreover, there was also a common belief, less common but common nonetheless, frequent enough to be at least called common, that one's guardian angel could actually appear as the person. So like in this case with Peter, which is why this is coming up here, there was a commonly held kind of almost folk belief, basically, that Peter's guardian angel, to use that modern terminology, could actually appear as Peter. Okay, so that's why they're saying. So that's why that's how their response makes sense contextually. It's more specifically on the folk belief, or that one's guardian angel could actually appear as the person, in this case Peter. So that's why that explains their response of, no, it's his angel. because of the commonly held folk belief that one's guardian angel could actually appear as the person, right? Like in terms of their appearance, their voice, etc., etc. And so there's there's a number of points here to make. The more contextually relevant part, which is kind of why this gets mentioned again, you just have to kind of zoom back out and see the meta-narrative point here. They've been praying all sorts of things for Peter. They would, of course, naturally pray that if it be God's will, that he would be freed, he would be released. But if not, that he would go bravely and faithfully to his death. The whole box and dice, right? I'm sure, no doubt, following the example of Christ in Gethsemane, right? Not my will, but yours be done, right? There's no problem with making particular invocations and requests on the front of, in this case, contextually, if it be your will, free Peter, save him from death, right? There's nothing wrong with that. But again, also praying the flip side of that equation of, if it be your will that Peter is to die, because that could have very well been God's will, then let him go faithfully and gloriously to his death as an example, as a testimony of martyrdom. So nevertheless, they've been praying all these things, and then one of the things which you would naturally assume they had been praying for, Peter's freedom and release, then happens, and they're like they're coming up with 1,000 different reasons as to why it can't be that. So it's like the very thing that they would have been praying for happens, and then it's like, no, you're out of your mind, Rhoda. No, it's kind of like it's almost like the inherent disbelief, even though they would have been logically, we'd right to assume that they would have been praying for that very thing to happen. And so there's that kind of. It's not exactly the same, but it's in a similar vein, at least, to a couple of chapters earlier with Peter's own vision of the multitudes of wild beasts and carrion birds, like birds of the air, coming down and rise Peter, kill and eat. And Peter's like, no, I can't do that because da-da-da-da-da-da, right? Similar in that sense, at least. And so there's the theological point to make about the actual, how might one say, their failure to believe that which they had even requested of God.
Well, there's lots of prayer meetings a bit like that.
I suppose, in one sense, yeah, exactly. And so that's an interesting point that should be drawn there. On the specifics of their response about angel, because I've been asked that question more times than I can count, because we as people tend to be fascinated with these things, even though not a lot of biblical time is actually dedicated to it, which is half the problem, but nevertheless. The concept here of what to use that term angelic guardian or guardian angel, interchangeably. There's nothing biblically that precludes that idea. We find no shortage of examples in the Old Testament, for example, where you have God sending these ministers of his, is how they're referred to, and I'll cover that in a second, out to assist his people. Moses, I forget exactly what chapter, but in Exodus, God says, I'll send my angel out before you. You have examples of angels ministering to specific people. Obviously, the book of Hebrews specifically describes these people, these beings, as ministering spirits, right, to serve the people of God. And again, there's nothing terribly difficult to understand in that reality. Again, God has created us. He has every ability to create another kind of being or creature that does a specific serves a specific function. That reference is Hebrews chapter 1, verse 14, for anyone who's wondering. Are not all ministering spirits, as in referring to angels, sent out to serve for the sake of those who are to inherit salvation, right? The people of God. There's even an example that can be drawn from that very point in Matthew 18, verse 10, in the parable of the lost sheep, for those who are familiar. But long story short, Christ says in verse 10 of Matthew chapter 18, see that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I tell you that in heaven their angels always see the face of my Father who is in heaven. Right, their angels, right, kind of inferring this kind of concept. Again, the balance has to be struck, because this is, I mean, as I'm saying, the tendency is to hyper-focus or to obsess over things which the scriptures don't spend a lot of time detailing. And that's kind of God's way of communicating inferentially that this is something that's not the primary focus of concern for you people. Yeah.
I've never heard a sermon on
That theological concept, yeah.
Personal angel.
Yeah,
I've heard it as an adjunct to angelology.
Yeah.
But I just looked up the Greek, and it's I've never read it in the Greek before.
There you go.
And it's a possessive.
Yes.
So it's stating that the angel pertains to Peter. It's his angel.
Yeah, that's one, and that's a connection between why their response makes rational sense. Whether or not that figure can actually appear like Peter, that we don't have any real biblical example of. So that's why I kind of just generically refer to it as like a folk belief, as a generic way of putting it. But the basis of the concept of to use the modern term guardian angel is not out of sorts at all with anything in the scriptures. It fits with what we see, at least. It makes contextual sense of the verses that we see, little as they are, that we actually have. It makes sense of the way in which we see them operate, if and when we do, which again is few and far between, but nonetheless. That doesn't mean the actual reality of how they're operating is few and far between. I mean, in terms of the biblical example, is few and far between contextually. And it makes sense of all those pieces. So it's a perfectly logical biblical belief to hold.
It's my understanding that there are evil spirits assigned to each human. Certainly C.S. Lewis in Screwtape Letters agrees with that. I have a feeling that I've taken that understanding from scripture, but I just can't think at the moment. Do you recall any reference?
The only reference we have, so what you're highlighting there is something that we tend to get from those who have converted out of the occult. So especially in particular if they've converted out of like real genuine occultic Satanism as a religion. I don't mean like Satanism as like this edgy, like, emo subculture. I mean like an actual legitimate commitment to a religious worldview and system. And that's where we tend to get that from. The veracity of that is not beyond, it's not beyond the pale. It's just not anything that we can draw specifically from the scriptures. The most that we can draw is that, and this is fairly rational, is that in ancient times you had a scenario where specific, dark spirits, if you want to refer to them that, or demonic entities, whatever you would like to call that, had more of a regional or national authority. The spirit of the Prince of Persia, for example, the spirit of the Prince of Greece. Prince here being referred to as the spirit being a prince of Greece.
They're territorial.
Territorial, that's what I'm referring to, regional, yeah. Regional/national, right, so territorial.
Plus the territorial nature of those in the Gennesaret incident with Jesus casting out
correct
the demonic entities from the two men at the
demoniac
tombs.
Yes, and so exactly, and so there's a regional or a geographical reality to it, national to it, what have you. Like it's kind of, you can conceptualize it different ways. That's certainly how, and that largely explains all the different biblical references to what the ancient world was like. Those who have dwelt in deep darkness, upon them light has now shone. Isaiah speaking in chapter 9 about the Messiah coming to the world, the great Savior, right? The nations around, the nations as opposed to the Israelites, right? Everyone who wasn't the Israelites was described as residing in darkness, and the most elementary of historical surveys would indicate that that's a fairly straightforward description. You had almost universal practices that defined cultures around the world. Sacrifice as a system, not all of them, but a lot of them, including human sacrifice, including including in certain cultures infanticide, so child sacrifice, ritual sex slavery, ritual prostitution, temple prostitution, mass slavery, mass pillaging, like a whole corpus of different things that were just either widespread, if not sometimes actual human universals. This is how the ancient world was, and we have a difficult time unless you study history on like a pretty concerted level, or a pretty serious level. Modern people tend to not really have a good grasp on what the ancient world really kind of looked like, as to how complex but horrific it often was.
Just from a logical standpoint, if the Hebrews were correct in saying that each human had an angel assigned to him,
sure,
then it just makes sense that Satan would assign his minion alongside.
There's nothing that precludes it. It's just that we don't have like a I'm not saying it to preclude it. It's just more like it would have to be an argument from silence. The regional one, the national one, like the actual territorial one, there is again, they're few and far between, but there are examples of that. And that fits the model of how we see the ancient world.
It's interesting in
happening.
Pop culture. You see some characters depicted with an angel on one shoulder, and a demon.
Yeah, that kind of cartoonish.
Shoulder. Isn't that interesting?
The cartoonish little image. Yeah, exactly. It's often that. So yeah, I take the point you're making there. Often that kind of little cartoonish example is the human attempt to externalize sin as well. I did this bad thing because of this external force. It definitely had nothing to do with the fact that I'm not morally righteous or perfect. It's the constant ways in which we tend to externalize wrongdoing and evil. It was the chip on my shoulder that made me do it, right? Yeah. I take your point on that sense. Yes. Nevertheless, on this front that we have here on the angelic side, perfectly, it keeps with anything we see biblically. Yeah.
I don't care which Christian it is, they would have to agree that this is certainly a potentially fascinating area of study.
It is very much, yes. It's fascinating. That's why it draws so much intrigue. It's just that it has to be very tempered by wisdom and discipline. When I say discipline,
discernment.
Yeah, exactly. Well, discernment's part of all of that. I use discipline in the sense of theological discipline. When I use that term, what I mean is I'm referring to the notion of ensuring that you remain biblically objective, that you allow the scriptures to speak, not you speaking into the scriptures what you think X, Y, and Z is meant to be, and allowing God to actually use the scriptures as He has designed them, right? You're 100% correct. It's a very fascinating area, and like it legitimately is. It's a great intrigue because it's something where we're dealing with something beyond the human condition, right? And the normal human existence. The flip side of that, and when I say discipline, what I mean is we can't start going beyond and expounding into all these unknown areas that the scriptures really clearly don't elaborate on. Like take, for example, there's exactly 3 angelic beings. These are a very broad category. They're not all the same, obviously, as you'll see when I mention them. There's only 3 that are ever actually named specifically. Michael, who's referred to in one single verse as an archangel. Gabriel, who's just simply referred to as an angel but by name. And then obviously Satan. Okay? Anything else beyond that, no one's mentioned.
Actually,
except for that. Oh, sorry. Yep.
Satan is not his name, of course.
No, it's a descriptor. No, it's not a personal name. None of the names are. I'm using it in the sense of like Michael and whatnot, but none of those epithets are. Well, obviously, they're epithets. But none of them are actually personal names. They're all titles. They're like, again, it's Shatan in the Hebrew simply means the accuser. Other references to him as a figure. It's likely that Apollyon or Abaddon in the book of Revelation is also this same angelic figure. Most likely, there's an argument to be made it's not, but it's almost certainly him. So again, Apollyon is merely the Greek word for the destroyer. Abaddon being its Hebrew equivalent, destruction. The common modern title of Lucifer is not actually anything that's ever describing him. It comes from a Latin the Latin phrase luciferos, which means light or light bearer, and comes from an unfortunate translation into the Latin of text from either Isaiah or Ezekiel about the son of the dawn, in reference to the king of Babylon, that was translated as Lucifer and kind of caught on as a name for him, when it's not talking about him, it's talking about the king of Babylon. But nonetheless, none of those are named here. The point I'm drawing here is this, though. If you actually go, like if you did a very simple Wikipedia search for whatever little that's worth these days, you would find that there's a whole host of other supposed angelic beings, Raphael, Uriel, on the dark side of things, Lilith, all these kinds of there's different names get hurled out from different sources, mainly from Talmudic sources that come after the Babylonian conquest, a lot of them. Some of them from apocryphal books, so books that were written that we know are not part of the actual biblical canon. And they come from those other sources. Now, some of those sources are worth reading to a degree, like the Book of Enoch is worth reading to a point. Other ones are very much not worth one's time in reading at all, because they're so obviously either forgeries or they're deuterocanonical in any case, and so on and so forth. You can find these very complex charts and books about this kind of subject of what's referred to in proper terms as angelology, or on the flip side, demonology. It's so much speculation and expounding upon things that are just simply not in the scripture, that for starters, why one has that level of concern for something that isn't talked about all that much is kind of the problem. It's becoming you've become imbalanced, right? You've become hyper-focused on something that the scriptures aren't really focused on all that much at all. And
like L.A. Marzulli.
Huh?
Like the Bible expositor L.A. Marzulli.
Oh, yeah, sure, yeah. There's no shortage of people who are supposed subject matter experts in these kinds of subjects, which don't have a great detail in the Bible. And the other side, and I'll finish on this, is one should be very careful with becoming like theologically obsessed or like really concerted with studying a subject like quote unquote demonology, if you want to call it that. The vast majority of Christians are not called to become extremely detailed and obsessed in their knowledge of the occult, and that's for a good reason. It's because, for starters, the vast majority of people can't handle it. And there's nothing wrong with that. No one, expected to be able to handle it. Secondly, and moreover, for those who even are called to minister to people in the occult and to actually teach and be faithful to that and so on and so forth, they're very few and far between. And it requires not only real knowledge of what on earth is going on there, but then a knowledge of how to actually evangelize and to minister to those people. Because at the end of the day, you are talking about ministering to people who, on the serious level, I don't mean the trite kind of just popular level where it occurs, where it's basically just like people going through it. It's rebellion for the sake of rebellion, if that makes sense. Like it's just contrarianism. You know what I mean? That's what a lot of it is. There's then the actual minority, which is the real hardcore, dead serious, who for starters don't look like what you think they look like, right? The person who's dressed like a 12th century witch isn't the person really doing it on a massive, almost never is the person doing it on a serious level. The person doing it on a serious level is the guy who's dressed exactly like I am right now in a suit and tie, working in an office.
To deceive you.
Yeah, and they work in a corporation, they work in a law firm, they work that's how a lot of it works, right? That's the dude who is dead serious, who's very, very real, and who you're going to find in a basement somewhere doing sacrifices with blood and drinking and the whole box and dice. That's the person. And you're trifling with things that have real legitimate power, at least in and of themselves, not in terms of their ultimate ability to, overcome the gospel or the kingdom, but real power in and of themselves. And that requires a level of knowledge and, more importantly, spiritual maturity is the point there. So I'll end the whole angel thing on that point there. So let's continue in verse 16. Peter continued knocking, as he's standing at the front saying, "Can I please come in?" Peter continues knocking, but when they opened, they saw him and were amazed. It's a fascinating contrast to what we just had read. But, verse 17, but motioning them with his hand to be silent, he described to them how the Lord had brought him out of the prison. So again, when it's saying they saw him and were amazed, they were like cheering, basically. And this is in the middle of the night, and the guards, there's no reason to think that the guards may not have already been looking for him by this point, if they've realised that he's gone. Again, we're not told. But nevertheless, he doesn't want his location. So he motions. He doesn't even say to them because he figured what he's doing here. He's going. That's what he's doing basically. He doesn't shut up. He's going. He's motioning with his hand to be quiet. Right, calm down, kind of quiet. Right, because they've basically gone into an uproar in excitement. They can't contain their excitement. So he motions to them to shut their mouths and to not blow the whole thing. And then he describes them, assuming he comes in or wherever he's in the courtyard or whatever the context is here, we're not told. But he describes to them how the Lord brought him out of prison. So he relays to them what happened. And he said, "Tell these things to James and the brothers." Again, brothers here is the generic plural adelphoi, so it can be technically referring to brothers and sisters as in like the whole church, which may very well be the case. I think it probably makes a bit more contextual sense if he's referring to the apostles, because he's just mentioned James, who's functionally speaking the head of the church here in Jerusalem, along with Peter. So whether or not the brothers is referring to the other apostles, or it's referring to the other apostles and the rest of the church, it's all one and the same, because telling the other apostles results in the apostles telling the church anyway. So it doesn't really particularly matter how one exegetes the word brothers there in terms of its meaning. But nevertheless, tell James, who is his other main leader, along with himself of the church at Jerusalem. Peter, basically the leader of the apostles. James, the leader of the church in Jerusalem, along with the rest of the apostles, obviously. Tell this what happened, and then he departed and went to another place. Right, so he didn't even stay there. We're not told specifically, but again, contextually we can infer that he then leaves so as to, thinking, well, the guards are going to come looking for me. I don't want to be caught here because this is one of our churches. This is one of our locations. So he very intelligently makes haste and goes away to another secret location that he has in order to not allow that site, that church, and the house of Mary, the mother of John Mark, to be compromised.
Wasn't he putting that house in great danger because the guards...
Oh, just by being there already was enough of it. That's what my point is, yeah.
Yes, the guards would have gone there. They would have interrogated the occupants.
Correct,
and the occupants, being believers, would not have lied. Would they?
No, not in that. Well, we'd hope not. No.
Have you seen Peter? Has
Well, we know that Peter has grown up by this point and matured because the whole point of his imprisonment is it's mirroring a very similar circumstance in which he was before. Again, this is the end. We're told that. This is the Antonian fortress, which is attached to the temple. It's on the northeastern side of the temple, I think. Either northwest or northeast. I'm pretty sure it's the northeastern side. The Antonian fortress, which is basically the jail of the temple itself. That's where he's housed. That's one of the potential locations that Christ himself was imprisoned. There's an argument to be made that it was maybe over at the Herodian palace, but anyway, it's possible that that's where Christ was actually held whilst imprisoned before his crucifixion, right? So if that's the location, then Peter has basically found himself quite literally where he was, all but a little over 10 years ago. At the exact same time of the year, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, so Passover, right? So the exact same time of the year, where right when Christ had been arrested, essentially he's called, "Do you know this man?" And he has his famous, tripartite denial, right? His triple denial. No, I don't know him. No, I don't know him. No, I don't know him. Which again would have occurred in and around this temple complex, right near the Antonian fortress. And then he finds himself in this same scenario, but he hasn't denied the faith. He hasn't rejected Christ, and he's so cool, calm, and collected, that he's choosing to spend his last hours on earth, what he thinks, having a nap, right? So he's grown and progressed incredibly, and that's meant to be a point that's inferred here. He realizes that he needs to communicate to the saints that he's been freed, right? There's a whole host of reasons as to why that would be the case. But then knows that it's enough of a risk him even appearing at that gate, as we're pointing out here, because he's already running the risk of compromising that site, that location. And so he doesn't, we're not told that he comes in and has a meal and blah, blah, blah. This probably is occurring in the courtyard, in whatever shape that would be, and then he leaves, right? So he does not stay there, he departs and goes to another place, right? To then hide out, another safe house, basically. So then in verse 18, now when the day came, as in the daytime, right? So the sunrise in the morning, right? Now when the day came, there was no little disturbance among the soldiers over what had become of Peter. That is to say, there was great disturbance, right? There was great disturbance over what had come of Peter. The guards were panicking. The guards were probably rather scared. The guards were probably angry at each other. There would have been infighting. You can imagine this kind of setting relatively easy, I'm sure. And so then in verse 19, and after Herod, as in referring to King Herod Agrippa, right? And after Herod searched for him and did not find him, he examined the sentries and ordered that they should be put to death. Then he went down from Judea to Caesarea and spent time there. Again, I explained this, we covered this kind of in passing last time, but this is the specifics of where it's mentioned. Again, it was by Roman law, it was if a guard allowed a prisoner to escape or something to happen to them, they would be subject to whatever that punishment was going to be. So it wasn't like automatically death necessarily, but it was the punishment for what, a lot of times it was death, obviously. But the strict reading of the Roman laws at that time was whatever the punishments. Like if this person was, I'm just speaking hypothetical, if this person was going to be given 20 lashes with a whip for stealing something, then the guards would receive that, right? If the person was to be put to death, as this was the case, right? Peter was on death row. The guards then get killed, right? And so he orders that the guards are then put to death. Again, I mentioned that, we talked about that last lesson, but for those who weren't here, the point that was drawn was that the church is praying for Peter for, among other things, his release, knowing fairly and rightfully that the consequence of that action would be the death of those guards, right? Because ultimately in this scenario, no one's innocent, right? The guards are not, merely because the guards are enlisted men, right? Troops, soldiers, does not free them from moral obligation. Okay, this is one of the defining points of what Christian theologians have then been able to define from the scriptures regarding warfare. Obviously, most famously, Augustine, right, in the 5th century, in his just war theory, which is the predicate for just about every international military treaty and agreement that we have at the moment. You have jus ad bellum, right? The right to go to war, and jus in bello, right in warfare, right? So in other words, it's not just enough to have the right reasons to go into war, and that now somehow justifies you in raping and pillaging your way through the land. It doesn't work that way. You have to conduct yourself morally in warfare as well, right? That's why what we now call the Nuremberg defense, right, which was one not the only obviously, but one of the seminal defenses made by SS officers during the Nuremberg trials after World War II. I was just doing my job, or I was just following orders. Your orders were to gas 6 million people. You don't get a free pass. It assumes moral agency on the part of every person, because we do have moral agency. We don't get to fall back on the excuse of pretending that we're just robots.
They knew what they were doing.
Oh, exactly. And even if they knew what they were doing, but it's even deeper than that. The point that was the big, not just legal or judicial, but indeed like genuinely theological point that came out of the Nuremberg trials was that even if you believe earnestly and powerfully with every fibre of your being that you're doing the right or good thing, that does not mean necessarily by consequence that you are actually doing the right thing, right? No, the common misconception about and you'll see how this ties back to the Guards here. The common misconception about the Nazis at any level, be it hardcore, actual, real Nazis like the SS, for example, or the SA, all the way down to just your average Wehrmacht soldier, right? So German army soldier. At any level that we're talking about, the common misconception is that all of Germany just became like, you know, the Galactic Empire from Star Wars. Like they're all just these evil figures, and they're all just had this evil intent of we're going to murder everyone. It's not even remotely close to what the German people believed. This is not like abdicating them. This is actually just giving an accurate representation. The German people, at all levels, very genuine, other than those who dissented, obviously, but everyone who did not dissent, the German people very, very genuinely and sincerely believed that they were entering the dawn of a new age of progress and growth, that our ideology of the German people would then raise all the nations around us, that we would be freed from the Untermenschen, right, the lesser people. And again, it wasn't necessarily by extermination, that was something that came later. It was by, we need to raise those who are below us, the Untermenschen meaning like subhumans, right, those who are the different classification levels of non-Aryans, and there was a hierarchy that they created of people who weren't Aryans or Germanics. We need to enlighten them. We need to bring them out of their own destitute and corrupt ways, and we're the ones who are going to lead the world into this bright and prosperous future. That was the ideology. That's a very simplified, oversimplified way of understanding it.
But then those who were truly born of the Holy Spirit never believed that.
Absolutely, yeah, exactly. Obviously, you know, famous examples like Dietrich Bonhoeffer,
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
And the Free Germans, right?
The others were hypnotized into.
Correct. Yes, exactly. Because they again, and that's why the average German person who went along with it they don't get off scot-free.
No.
Right. The average person in Germany. That's what I'm saying. The average person during Nazi Germany was not this terrifying dude, 6'4", blonde hair, just, you know, Hitler's dream guy, in the full black uniform with the SS skull on the cap, talking about how we need to rid the world of these Jew rats. That's not what the average German looked like. The average German looked like a very well put together man and his wife with their little kids, who would then on a, you know, Saturday morning, Sunday morning, wake up, they'd have a lovely breakfast, right? Have a nice meal, be happy, friendly to each other. They'd all get dressed up, get in their suit and tie, get in their nice dress, make sure their hair's combed.
Obedience.
All obedient, all nice and well put together, very professional looking, and walk outside as a family, holding hands, smiling, walk down the street where everyone else is gathered, line up on the streets, throw up the sign and say Sieg Heil. That's the average German. Do you understand? And that's the reason why the whole thing worked. Up until it didn't, obviously. Yeah. But that's why the system was even able to stand on its own 2 feet.
Except for the few who didn't.
Exactly, except for the few who didn't. Yeah.
Are you talking about Nazi Germany or COVID lockdown? COVID?
Yeah,
I'm slightly confused.
I was about to say, isn't that the same day?
Yeah,
they're gonna, what is it, they're gonna do, reset the world.
Yeah, that one, yeah, exactly.
Similarities, wow.
Yeah, so that's an interesting point. I might as well touch on it because it's a very important point to make. So there are a lot of similarities. They're not exhaustive because there are real world differences that are worth mentioning. But there are a number of similarities, yes, between what happened around the world, but particularly in the West during COVID compared to the Nazi Reich, right? I will say though that I actually think there's a much better comparison, and it's actually a lot closer to home. What we did during 2020, 2021, kind of trailing into 22, but certainly at least those 2 years of 20 and 21, are actually up and down the board exactly the same as the way that we operated during World War I, right? We look back on World War One with somber, a somber attitude, but a relative fondness, right? We respect greatly what our ancestors did during that time, and that's fair enough, and that's fine. But the way in which society functioned for that 4 to 5 year period was exactly like what happened during COVID. If you, for any reason, did not go and fight, and there's a whole host of reasons why someone would not fight. Some of it was an actual inability physically to go. Others was the fact that they had vulnerable families who they needed to take care of themselves. A whole host of reasons why a man might not go to war. You were absolutely demonized. You were absolute trash. You were scum. You were unpatriotic. You hated your fellow Australians. How dare you stay here while our boys are over on the front? Now keep in mind, our boys are over on the front getting slaughtered in a battle they're never going to win, like Anzac Cove. And this is not just me throwing out insults. Again, my great-grandfather was there. My great-grandfather was on the first boat to Gallipoli, right? He'd been in this country for all about 5 minutes, having emigrated here from Wales, and he was one of the first 1,000 guys to sign up for the war. So this is not something that I'm speaking of just lightheartedly. I come from a military family. But you were treated as absolute scum.
Conscientious objectors were jailed.
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, and he too. Yeah, all over the place. And you were not only jailed, but you were viewed as just a disgraceful, immoral person.
To the country.
Yeah.
I can remember that.
Yeah.
It was about when that was going on.
Yeah, exactly.
As a war progress, I might have been about 10.
Exactly, because exactly the same in World War II. Exactly.
Those kind of things
100%.
being said.
Yeah, and we didn't learn our lesson by World War II. Exactly, and you'd have women back home whose husbands were over in the front hand out little white flowers, and give them to men who weren't here, and they'd yell shame, 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 shame. There's a whole host of other things that went on during that time as well, of those who didn't comply with whatever the current thing was, in this case the war. That's a lot more like what was going on, but yes, there are similarities certainly between the Reich and what happened in 2020 and 2021. The better comparison is to what we ourselves did in World War One. That's the best comparison, because up and down the list, that's not an exhaustive list that I gave. There's so many other things.
I lived in World War II.
True, yeah, and the same. No, exactly. But the same thing happened there with World War II, though. No, but a very similar thing happened with World War II.
You look really good for 110.
Yeah, exactly. No, but the same thing happened. But the point, that's why I'm drawing the connection. A very similar thing happened to World War II. Not to the exact same degree, but a very similar thing still happened in World War II. But in World War I, it was atrocious. If you didn't go over and fight, you were absolute, literally like a dog. That hated his fellow countrymen, which is exactly how it was treated in 2020 and 2021, about doing the right thing. And who determines what the right thing is? Well, whatever the government says. And that somehow is the metric of what determines right and wrong, is whatever the government says. So why are we over here? And so why are we over here fighting World War One? Because, so we're part of the British Empire, cool. So why are we fighting them? Because Germany declared war on Serbia. Right, okay, but so why did that happen? Well, because this Serbian dude shot the Archduke of Austria-Hungary, right? But see, why did that happen? Well, because, and you just trail back through all these historical reasonings of what essentially amounted to an imperial tug of war between the great powers in a war that, quite frankly, never should have happened. Never should have happened. And the only reason the second one happened is because the first one happened.
But is it going to be a third?
Well, hopefully not. It certainly won't be predicated on the same thing, which I think is why we've been spared from that. World War II was just essentially round two of the very same war, of the supposed war to end all wars, as you may recall it being called. Didn't quite turn out that way. Nonetheless, blind compliance is never a moral excuse. Human beings do not get to obfuscate their own moral agency, and that includes for even people, proverbially down the ladder or the rung here, like the soldiers. These are not even important. These aren't even commanders of soldiers. These are just literally the grunts guarding the prison. You don't get to be morally obfuscated from that. And that's made the point here through the fact that their death is not a great immoral thing that occurs. And more importantly, it wasn't like, they were in the moral wrong, but others the others who ordered this were clear. No, they weren't, because we then, next week, we'll fast forward into the end of the chapter, where Herod Agrippa is killed for a specific thing that trails back thematically to what this was, right? There's a very good reason why verses 20 to 25 are kind of chronologically or textually connected to this passage, right? It's moving on a bit in time, potentially by maybe, who knows how long, but at least, like maybe a year or two, perhaps, who knows. Nonetheless, Herod Agrippa has himself set up to be worshipped as a god, and the people do that, and he's struck dead for that. That didn't happen overnight. It comes from this whole immoral system that was going on, of which we already had an accounting with the false imprisonment of Peter. Okay, so we'll cover that next time. This whole thing finishes obviously by saying, then he, as in referring to Herod Agrippa, went down from Judea to Caesarea and spent time there. Caesarea is referring to Caesarea Maritima, right? So not Philippi, but the one on the coast, which we've encountered a number of times before.
I remember that.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. That's what it's referring to. And again, there was a very wealthy city, significant city, a new city. Pontius Pilate, when he was governor and praetor, he had residence there in Caesarea Maritima as well. And again, there was also a royal palace there in Caesarea Maritima. So it's what Windsor Castle is to Buckingham Palace, so to speak, in regards to the British royal family. It's another major location that Herod Agrippa would also go to, Caesarea Maritima. So that's where he is when we then come into the next lesson. So, any final questions or comments or anything?
Can I just think back to the prayer meeting that they're all having?
Sure, yeah.
They're praying for Peter.
Mm-hmm.
There'd be quite a crowd there, probably.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
And people pray differently. Some are praying, release them. Some are praying, give them food and whatever they're praying.
Sustain him, yeah, the whole box and dice probably, yeah.
And when Rhoda goes to the gate and comes in and says, Peter's at the gate.
Yep.
They are so surprised.
Shocked, yeah. Shocked to the point of disbelief, yeah.
They didn't really believe he would be there because to them, could God have done something so amazing?
Exactly, yeah.
When God answers an amazing prayer.
Yep,
you
correct.
see, did it really happen?
Yeah, correct, yeah. And that's exactly the point, yeah, 100%, is that their disbelief is shown here, because the point is that they're trying to draw contrast.
But
is
they're
that
doing the right thing by praying.
Oh, absolutely. No, they are very much. But at the same time, though, it's almost like the inference that can be drawn is that it's almost like, at least for a portion of this, they were almost praying out of obligation.
Yes.
Do you understand what I'm saying? So
it was the right thing to do. Right?
Yeah, and exactly, and that's perfectly good. I'm not chastising for that at all. But the point being drawn, right, is that it was almost like, when I say obligatory or by obligation, it's almost like by duty. So like, this is what I should be praying, and so I'm going to say and utter the words, but without the actual commensurate belief that the very thing you're even beseeching God for could even happen.
Lord, do a miracle. Make it such a miracle that we're amazed. I wonder if anyone
Maybe, who knows, yeah. Pray for the whole box. No, that's exactly right. It's not, all of there is very little point in, it's the balance, right? Our prayer is primarily, not exclusively, just simply primarily, prayer is primarily not about using God as like a proverbial genie in the bottle, right? Where we're just making requests of like, do this, do that. That's not the point. The point is to conform our will to God's will. Okay. At the exact same time, God hears the prayers of his people, right? And doesn't change the world based on the request of what a human being asks. That has the whole universe flipped on its head, right? Because again, keeping in mind, God is sovereign over all time and history. The reason why we're able to point to that sovereignty is because of the logical reality that God exists beyond time. He knows it all because he's already written it all, right? Including our very praying for the thing in the first place. And again, logically speaking, I know it's stretching the limits of our logical capabilities, but the very instance or the notion of us, let's take these guys as an example. God knew of their prayers before he even uttered the words, "Let there be light," during the creation, right? This is not, from our temporal perspective, we don't have an ability to comprehend what on earth this means, how like, as in like in true depth, because we're confined temporally. He's not, right? Right? It's not difficult to figure out the sovereignty of God as it's presented in the scriptures when you actually understand that God exists beyond time, and that he exists before time. He created time. Time is the temporal dimension is his creation, and so their very praying of this is not like, oh, if I don't pray for this, it won't happen. If I do, it will. That's not how the world works. Correct. That's exactly correct. That's not how the world works, right? But from our own first person in time and space perspective, it is about our growing in conformity to God's will, right? That's the overarching premise of what prayer is to be.
God wants us to pray.
Exactly, 100%. Yes, because it shows the desire, not my will, but yours be done, right? The desire for God's will to be enacted and followed through in the world, right? But at the same time, God is omnipresent, God is omnipotent, meaning all powerful. He brings into alignment and conformity, not in the moment, but again, before the very creation of the world, what we're going to pray for and what he's going to do in the first place as a demonstration or as a testimony of his power over history and over the world.
So men should keep praying.
Absolutely.
Men, but
Yeah, man.
Says man.
Yeah, man. Yeah, humanity. Yeah,
Humanity
people.
should keep praying.
Yeah, of course.
But not to kill off the resetting of the world, because the Bible already tells us there's a new.
Yeah, like it's a matter of, we don't have the ability to like influence what's going to happen on this front or that front. Like, we don't have this, like, if I, like, let's put it in like a really human terms. You have a loved one who's in a car crash and they're in hospital and it's, they're in critical condition, right? It's not like, if I pray harder and more fervently and more, and I feel it more, whatever that means, that'll impact the result. No, it won't impact the result at all. Just as on a technical level, if you sat there and did nothing prayer-wise, it's not going to impact the result. In terms of the grand scheme of things, that's not the point though, because the problem is both sides of the equation. It's not, well, my prayers don't actually move the needle in the world, therefore I won't do it at all. No, there's a whole host of biblical reasons why that's not the case, and that would require, obviously, sermons. On the flip side, we are not to have the view, as unfortunately sometimes people do, that my prayers are actually going to have like this tangible consequence that otherwise would not have happened if I didn't do it. Do you understand the distinction I'm making? It's really important, right? Our prayers to God, our invocations to him are very much connected to what goes on in the world. I'm making the very important distinction between our praying to God being the reason, like functionally, why the needle gets moved, if that makes sense. That's what I'm referring to. It's more complex than that, but that's what I'm referring to when I say things like not using God as a genie in a bottle, right? It's just like request and request and request. If I don't request it, then it won't happen. Like, it's not how the world works.
The Holy Spirit takes our groanings and presents them to a prayer.
Yeah, absolutely.
To our Heavenly Father.
Correct, yeah.
Because there are things in the Bible that we know will come to pass, but we don't pray that they'll not come to pass.
Yeah, at any real genuine level, yeah, like it's not, when we have our, the reason why those pastoral prayers that we do are important, right? When we're making invocations to God and after having given thanksgivings and et cetera, and we're invocating him in order to, protect Christian children from corrupt teachings in the world, right? And from the influence of those who seek to do evil, okay? We're doing that not on the basis that, because I've now prayed this, now it'll happen, as opposed to if we didn't, it won't happen. We're doing it to demonstrate righteousness and to demonstrate that the desires of our will, of our heart, that is to say, right, are aligned with what God himself has revealed about himself and about what he desires in the world, right? That's the point and the purpose, right?
It's not willing that any should perish in the long run, that says that.
Sure, yeah, exactly. God doesn't desire the death of the wicked, no. But it happens because of this thing called justice.
Yeah.
Right? So all those various things. It's just like, again, a loved one or a friend is not going to come to repentance and trust in Christ because your prayers had magical powers to bring it about. Yeah, it's not how it works. It's not like this karmic force in the universe. Yeah. So.
Oh shucks! You mean I've been wasting all these years?
Well, that's the view that then.
Coming to church and reading the Bible.
Well, that's unfortunately sometimes how I'm saying that's how it becomes, and that's half the problem. Is and that's why, yeah, exactly, like the word of faith movement. That's why it's point blank heresy. It's this idea that your prayers have this like literal like magic ability practically to change the very fabric of reality is not how it works. It does not work that way, and so we need a more thorough.
Going to church gives me pleasure.
Exactly, yes. It brings great joy, and it demonstrates, above all things, obedience. It demonstrates obedience. We're commanded to join together, not commanded to, bend the knee and fall prostrate before the state and say, "Can you please tell us when we are or are not allowed to gather at church?" Like we did during that COVID period. Nonetheless, I'll end there. So next lesson we'll finish off the chapter 12 in verses 20 through 25. So thank you.